a Wikividi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Edward VIII. Edward VIII was King of the United Kingdom and the Dominions of the British Empire, and Emperor of India, from the 20th of January 1936 until his abdication on the 11th of December the same year, after which he became the Duke of Windsor. Edward was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary. He was named Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday, 9 weeks after his father succeeded as king. As a young man, he served in the British Army during the First World War and undertook several overseas tours on behalf of his father. Edward became king on his father's death in early 1936. However, he showed impatience with court protocol, and caused concern among politicians by his apparent disregard for established constitutional conventions. Only months into his reign, he caused a constitutional crisis by proposing to Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was seeking a divorce from her second. The Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom and the Dominions opposed the marriage, arguing a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands was politically and socially unacceptable as a prospective queen consort. Additionally, such a marriage would have conflicted with Edward's status as the titular head of the Church of England, which at the time disapproved of remarriage after divorce if a former spouse was still alive. Edward knew the British government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, would resign if the marriage went ahead, which could have forced a general election, and would ruin his status as a politically neutral constitutional monarch. When it became apparent he could not marry Wallis and remain on the throne, Edward abdicated. He was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI, with a reign of 326 days. Edward is one of the shortest reigning monarchs in British history. After his abdication, he was created Duke of Windsor. He married Wallis in France on 3 June 1937, after her second divorce became final. Later that year, the couple toured Germany. During the Second World War, he was at first stationed with the British military mission to France. But after private accusations he held Nazi sympathies, he was appointed governor of the Bahamas. After the war, Edward spent the rest of his life in retirement in France. Edward and Wallis remained married until his death in 1972. Early life. Edward was born on the 23rd of June 1894 at White Lodge, Richmond Park, on the outskirts of London during the reign of his great-grandmother Queen Victoria. He was the eldest son of the Duke and Duchess of York. His father was the son of the Prince and Princess of Wales. His mother was the eldest daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Teck. At the time of his birth, he was third in the line of succession to the throne, behind his grandfather and father. He was baptized Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David in the Green Drawing Room of White Lodge on 16 July 1894 by Edward White Benson, Archbishop of Canterbury. The names were chosen in honor of Edward's late uncle, who was known to his family as Eddie, or Edward, and his great-grandfather King Christian IX of Denmark. The name Albert was included at the behest of Queen Victoria for her late husband Albert, Prince Consort, and the last 4 names George, Andrew, Patrick and David came from the patron saints of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. He was always known to his family and close friends by his last given name, David. As was common practice with upper-class children of the time, Edward and his younger siblings were brought up by nannies rather than directly by their parents. One of Edward's early nannies often abused him by pinching him before he was due to be presented to his parents. His subsequent crying and wailing would lead the Duke and Duchess to send him and the nanny away. The nanny was discharged after her mistreatment of the children was discovered. Edward's father, though a harsh disciplinarian, was demonstrably affectionate, and his mother displayed a frolicsome side with her children that belied her austere public image. She was amused by the children making tadpoles on toast for their French master, and encouraged them to confide in her. Education. Initially, Edward was tutored at home by Helen Bricker. When his parents travelled the British Empire for almost 9 months following the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, young Edward and his siblings stayed in Britain with their grandparents, Queen Alexandra and King Edward VII, who showered their grandchildren with affection. Upon his parents' return, Edward was placed under the care of 2 men, Frederick Finch and Henry Hansel, who virtually brought up Edward and his brothers and sister for their remaining nursery years. Edward was kept under the strict tutorship of Hansel until almost 13 years old. Private tutors taught him German and French. Edward took the examination to enter the Royal Naval College, Osborne, and began there in 1907. Hansel had wanted Edward to enter school earlier, but the prince's father had disagreed. Following 2 years at Osborne College, which he did not enjoy, Edward moved on to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. A course of 2 years, followed by entry into the Royal Navy, was planned. A bout of mumps may have made him infertile. Edward automatically became Duke of Cornwall and Duke of Rothesay on 6 May 1910 when his father ascended the throne as George V on the death of Edward VII. He was created Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester a month later on 23 June 1910, his 16th birthday. Preparations for his future as king began in earnest. He was withdrawn from his naval course before his formal graduation, served as midshipman for 3 months aboard the battleship Hindustan, then immediately entered Magdalen College, Oxford, for which, in the opinion of his biographers, he was underprepared intellectually. A keen horseman, he learned how to play polo with the university club. He left Oxford after 8 terms, without any academic qualifications. Prince of Wales. Edward was officially invested as Prince of Wales in a special ceremony at Carnarvon Castle on 13 July 1911. The investiture took place in Wales, at the instigation of the Welsh politician David Lloyd George, Constable of the Castle and Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Liberal government. Lloyd George invented a rather fanciful ceremony in the style of a Welsh pageant, and coached Edward to speak a few words in Welsh. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Edward had reached the minimum age for active service and was keen to participate. He had joined the Grenadier Guards in June 1914. And although Edward was willing to serve on the front lines, Secretary of State for War Lord Kitchener refused to allow it, citing the immense harm that would occur if the heir to the throne were captured by the enemy. Despite this, Edward witnessed trench warfare firsthand and visited the front line as often as he could, for which he was awarded the Military Cross in 1916. His role in the war, although limited, made him popular among veterans of the conflict. Edward undertook his first military flight in 1918, and later gained a pilot's license. Edward's youngest brother, Prince John, died at the age of 13 on 18 January 1919 after a severe seizure. John suffered from epilepsy, and Edward, who was 11 years older than his brother and had hardly known him, saw his death as little more than a regrettable nuisance. He wrote to his mistress of the time that he had told her all about the little brother, and how he was an epileptic. John has been practically shut up for the last 2 years anyhow, so no one has ever seen him except the family, and then only once or twice a year. This poor boy had become more of an animal than anything else. He also wrote an insensitive letter to his mother, Queen Mary, which has since been lost. She did not reply, but he felt compelled to write her an apology, in which he stated, "I feel such a cold-hearted and unsympathetic swine for writing all that I did. No one can realize more than you how little poor Johnny meant to me who hardly knew him. I feel so much for you, darling Mama," who was his mother. Throughout the 1920s, Edward, as Prince of Wales, represented his father, King George V, at home and abroad on many occasions. His rank, travels, good looks, and unmarried status gained him much public attention. And at the height of his popularity, he was the most photographed celebrity of his time. He took a particular interest in science, and in 1926 was president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science when his alma mater, Oxford University, hosted the Society's annual general meeting. He also visited the poverty-stricken areas of Britain, and undertook 16 tours to various parts of the empire between 1919 and 1935. On a tour of Canada in 1919, he acquired the Bedingfield Ranch, near Pakisco, Alberta, and in 1924, he donated the Prince of Wales Trophy to the National Hockey League. In 1929, Sir Alexander Leith, a leading Conservative in the north of England, persuaded him to make a 3-day visit to the County Durham and Northumberland coalfields, where at the time there was much unemployment. From January to April 1931, The Prince of Wales and his brother Prince George travelled 18,000 miles on a tour of South America, steaming out on the ocean liner, and returning via Paris and an Imperial Airways flight from Paris-Le Bourget Airport that landed specially in Windsor Great Park. Though widely travelled, Edward was racially prejudiced against foreigners and many of the Empire's subjects, believing that whites were inherently superior. In 1920, on a visit to Australia, he wrote of Indigenous Australians, "They are the most revolting form of living creatures I've ever seen. They are the lowest known form of human beings and are the nearest thing to monkeys." In 1919 the Prince agreed to be president of the organising committee for the proposed British Empire exhibition at Wembley Park, northwest London. The Prince wished the exhibition to include a great national sports ground, and so played a part in the creation of Wembley Stadium. Romances. In 1917, during the First World War, he began a love affair with Parisian courtesan Marguerite Alibert, who kept a collection of his indiscreet letters after he broke off the affair in 1918 to begin one with an English married woman, Freda Dudley Ward, a textile heiress. Edward's womanizing and reckless behavior during the 1920s and 1930s worried Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, King George V, and those close to the Prince. Alan Lascelles, the Prince's private secretary for 8 years during this period, believed that, for some hereditary or physiological reason, his normal mental development stopped dead when he reached adolescence. George V was disappointed by his son's failure to settle down in life, disgusted by his affairs with married women, and was reluctant to see him inherit the crown. "After I am dead," George said, "the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." Second in line to the throne was the prince's younger brother Albert. Albert and his wife, Elizabeth, had 2 children, including Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II. George V favoured Albert and his granddaughter Elizabeth and told a courtier, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." In 1929, Time magazine reported that the Prince of Wales teased his sister-in-law by calling her Queen Elizabeth. The magazine asked if she did not sometimes wonder how much truth there is in the story that he once said he would renounce his rights upon the death of George V, which would make her nickname come true. In 1930, George V gave the prince the lease of Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. There, he continued his relationships with a series of married women, including Freda Dudley Ward and Lady Furness, the American wife of a British peer, who introduced the prince to her friend and fellow American Wallis Simpson. Simpson had divorced her first husband, U.S. naval officer Win Spencer, in 1927. Her second husband, Ernest Simpson, was a British-American businessman. Wallis Simpson and the Prince of Wales, it is generally accepted, became lovers, while Lady Furness travelled abroad, although the prince adamantly insisted to his father that he was not having an affair with her and that it was not appropriate to describe her as his mistress. Edward's relationship with Simpson, however, further weakened his poor relationship with his father. Although King George V and Queen Mary met Simpson at Buckingham Palace in 1935, they later refused to receive her. Edward's affair with an American divorcee led to such grave concern that the couple were followed by members of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, who examined in secret the nature of their relationship. An undated report detailed a visit by the couple to an antique shop, where the proprietor later noted that the lady seemed to have power, Prince of Wales, completely under her thumb. The prospect of having an American divorcee with a questionable past having such sway over the heir apparent led to anxiety among government and establishment figures. Reign. King George V died on the 20th of January 1936, and Edward ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. The next day, accompanied by Simpson, he broke with custom by watching the proclamation of his own accession from a window of St. James's Palace. He became the first monarch of the British Empire to fly in an aircraft when he flew from Sandringham to London for his accession council. Edward caused unease in government circles with actions that were interpreted as interference in political matters. His comment during a tour of depressed villages in South Wales that something must be done for the unemployed coal miners was seen as an attempt to guide government policy, though it has never been clear what sort of remedy he had in mind. government ministers were reluctant to send confidential documents and state papers to Fort Belvedere, because it was clear that Edward was paying little attention to them, and it was feared that Simpson and other house guests might read them improperly or inadvertently revealing government secrets. Edward's unorthodox approach to his role also extended to the coinage that bore his image. He broke with the tradition that the profile portrait of each successive monarch faced in the direction opposite to that of his or her predecessor. Edward insisted that he face left, to show the parting in his hair. Only a handful of test coins were struck before the abdication, and all are very rare. When George VI succeeded to the throne, he also faced left to maintain the tradition by suggesting that, had any further coins been minted featuring Edward's portrait, they would have shown him facing right. On the 16th of July 1936, an Irish fraudster called Jerome Bannigan, alias George Andrew McMahon, produced a loaded revolver as Edward rode on horseback at Constitution Hill, near Buckingham Palace. Police spotted the gun and pounced on him. He was quickly arrested. At Bannigan's trial, he alleged that a foreign power had approached him to kill Edward, that he had informed MI5 of the plan, and that he was merely seeing the plan through to help MI5 catch the real culprits. The court rejected the claims and sent him to jail for a year for intent to alarm. It is now thought that Bannigan had indeed been in contact with MI5, but the veracity of the remainder of his claims remains open. In August and September, Edward and Simpson cruised the eastern Mediterranean on the steam yacht Narlin. By October it was becoming clear that the new king planned to marry Simpson, especially when divorce proceedings between the Simpsons were brought at Ipswich Assizes. Although gossip about his affair was widespread in the United States, the British media kept voluntarily silent, and the public knew nothing until early December. Abdication. On the 16th of November 1936, Edward invited British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Buckingham Palace and expressed his desire to marry Wallis Simpson when she became free to remarry. Baldwin informed him that his subjects would deem the marriage morally unacceptable, largely because remarriage after divorce was opposed by the Church of England, and the people would not tolerate Simpson as Queen. As King, Edward was the titular head of the Church of England, and the clergy expected him to support the Church's teachings. Edward proposed an alternative solution of a morganatic marriage, in which he would remain king, but Simpson would not become queen. She would enjoy some lesser title instead, and any children they might have would not inherit the throne. This too was rejected by the British cabinet as well as other Dominion governments, whose views were sought pursuant to the Statute of Westminster 1931, which provided in part that any alteration in the law touching the succession to the throne or the royal style and titles shall hereafter require the assent as well of the parliaments of all the dominions as of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. The Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and South Africa made clear their opposition to the king marrying a divorcee. Their Irish counterpart expressed indifference and detachment, while the Prime Minister of New Zealand, having never heard of Simpson before, vacillated in disbelief. Faced with this opposition, Edward at first responded that there were not many people in Australia, and their opinion did not matter. Edward informed Baldwin that he would abdicate if he could not marry Simpson. Baldwin then presented Edward with three choices: give up the idea of marriage, marry against his minister's wishes, or abdicate. It was clear that Edward was not prepared to give up Simpson, and he knew that if he married against the advice of his ministers, he would cause the government to resign, prompting a constitutional crisis. He chose to abdicate. Edward duly signed the instruments of abdication at Fort Belvedere on the 10th of December 1936 in the presence of his younger brothers, Prince Albert, Duke of York, next in line for the throne, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and Prince George, Duke of Kent. The next day, the last act of his reign was the royal assent to His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936, as required by the Statute of Westminster. All the dominions consented to the abdication. On the night of the 11th of December 1936, Edward, now reverted to the title and style of a prince, explained his decision to abdicate in a worldwide radio broadcast. He famously said, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. Edward departed Britain for Austria the following day. He was unable to join Simpson until her divorce became absolute, several months later. His brother, the Duke of York, succeeded to the throne as George VI. George Vi's elder daughter, Princess Elizabeth, became heir presumptive. Brought to you by Wikividi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?